8 women stood in a courtroom in Carrickfergus in March 1711, and not one of them had a lawyer. They were accused of bewitching an 18-year-old girl, a girl who, by the way, never said a single word in court. Not one word. Her accusations had already been written down, handed over, and that was that. The women denied everything. It didn't matter. The jury convicted all 8 of them on the same afternoon, and then, a few months later, the man connected to 2 of those women went to trial too, and by then, the girl who'd accused him was dead, which, under the law they were using, upgraded his crime, from injury to murder by witchcraft. This is Island Magee, County Antrim, 1711, Ireland's last witch trial, and I want to walk you through the whole thing. The house where it started, the depositions that still exist, the judges who disagreed with each other in open court, and the plaque that went up in 2023 that still can't bring itself to say the word innocent. Because someone objected. In 2023, stay with me. Let's start with the place, because the place matters. Island Magee is a peninsula, 8 miles long on the east coast of County Antrim. Not quite an island, not quite mainland. In the early 18th century, it held around 300 people, most of them Presbyterian, most of them of Scots descent, Ulster Scots families who'd come across from Scotland in the previous century and brought their church, their language, and their beliefs with them. And one of those beliefs, stronger in Scottish Presbyterian tradition than in English Anglican practice, was that witchcraft was real, active, and directly connected to Satan, not superstition, theology. The devil worked through people, and those people could be identified and prosecuted. That's the air on Island Magee in 1710. There's a house at the north end of the peninsula, in the townland of Kilcone Moor. It gets called No Head House in the later accounts. A Presbyterian minister named John Haltridge had lived there. By 1710 he was dead, and his widow, Anne Haltridge, was living in the house with her son James and James's wife. That house is where this story begins, not with the trial, with something happening in September 1710 that Anne Haltridge could not explain. In September 1710, Anne Haltridge began reporting that something was tormenting her in her own home. The accounts call it a strange force. They're not specific in ways we can verify. The surviving documents are a pamphlet, some pre-trial depositions, letters, and newspaper reports, and none of them give you a clean chronology of those early months. What they agree on is that Anne, an elderly widow, a minister's widow, a woman of standing in this community, said she was being attacked, and that the attacks went on for months, through the autumn of 1710 into the winter. The community around her didn't dismiss it. This was Island Magee. These were people for whom demonic interference was a live category. Local clergy got involved. Physicians were called. Nothing helped. And then in February 1711, Anne Haltridge died. The accounts call it sudden. Whether the months of reported torment contributed to her death in some physical sense. The shock, the sleeplessness, the fear. We can't know. What we know is that she died, and that her funeral brought someone new to No Head House, an 18-year-old woman named Mary Dunar, who had come to keep company with the widow left behind. And within days of her arrival, the house had a new problem. Mary Dunar is described in the sources as an educated gentlewoman. She'd moved to the area in 1710 from Castlereagh, which was then in County Down, though some sources just say County Down, and she came to No Head House after Anne Haltridge's funeral because Mrs. James Haltridge, Anne's daughter-in-law, wanted company. The exact family relationship between Mary and the Haltridges is one of those things the sources can't agree on. Some call her Anne's niece. Some say she was cousin to Mrs. James Haltridge. The documents don't settle it. What they do settle is what happened to her after she arrived. She began having fits, violent, dramatic, theologically loaded fits, shouting, swearing, blaspheming, throwing Bibles, going rigid every time a clergyman came near her, vomiting household items, pins, buttons, nails, glass, wool. That last detail shows up in multiple accounts. The vomiting of objects was a recognized symptom in the demonology of the time. It meant something was being done to you by someone. It wasn't random suffering, it was evidence of an agent, and Mary Dunar, in the middle of her fits, began naming agents. She said she could see them. Women. Women who came to her in spectral form and tormented her, and she was prepared to name them. Local authorities got involved quickly. This is worth noting. The response wasn't skepticism, it was procedure. The mayor of Carrickfergus, a man named Edward Clements, who was also a justice of the peace, came to take depositions. He sat with witnesses and wrote down what they said, formally, under oath. And Mary Dunar, assisted by these local authorities, identified 8 women she said had attacked her in spectral form. 8 specific women with names from the community. The depositions Clements took are dated in the original documents to 1710, but that's a Julian calendar artifact. The Julian calendar ran its new year from the 25th of March, so dates in January and February were still technically the previous year. Under the Gregorian calendar, which Britain wouldn't officially adopt until 1752, those depositions fall in early 1711. Historians note this discrepancy. It matters because the depositions are the only surviving pretrial documents from an Irish witchcraft case. The originals are held in Trinity College, Dublin. They're not a pamphlet reconstruction or a newspaper summary. They're the actual sworn statements, taken at the time, in the room. And they record what Mary Dunar said and what the witnesses around her said in the weeks before the trial. That's the paper trail. It's thin, but it's real. The 8 women Mary Dunar named were Janet Carson, Janet Latimer, Janet Main, Janet Miller, Margaret Mitchell, Catherine McCalman, Janet Liston, and Elizabeth Cellar. 4 Janets. You notice that. In a community this size, 300 people on an 8-mile peninsula. These were not strangers. These were neighbors, people whose faces you'd know from market day and church. The sources describe them as having lived blameless lives and attending Christian worship regularly. That's actually language from one of the judges at the trial, and we'll get to him. But it tells you something about who these women were. They weren't outcasts. They weren't already marginalized in ways that made them obvious targets. They were part of the community. The W17111.org project, which is the most thorough academic effort to collect and verify the surviving sources, notes that later accounts have sometimes described the accused as poor and disabled. But that characterization doesn't trace cleanly to the 1711 documents themselves. What the documents show is 8 women, named by one 18-year-old in the grip of fits, with no legal representation, facing a charge that carried a statutory penalty under a law that was over 100 years old. The Witchcraft Act of 1586, Irish law, still on the books. The Witchcraft Act of 1586 is the legal frame for everything that follows, so it's worth a moment. Ireland had its own witchcraft statute separate from the English one. The 1586 Act set out 2 tiers of punishment. If you were convicted of causing injury by witchcraft, hurting someone, tormenting them, making them ill, the penalty was 1 year's imprisonment and 4 appearances in the pillory on market day, 6 hours each time. If you were convicted of causing death by witchcraft, the penalty was death. That distinction is going to matter enormously when we get to the September trial. For now, the 8 women were charged under the injury provision. Mary Dunar was alive. She was suffering, according to the evidence, but she was alive. The trial was set for the spring assizes, the county Antrim criminal court sitting in Carrickfergus. And I want to be clear about something. No official records of the trial and verdict survive. Any court documents that existed until 1922 were almost certainly destroyed when the Public Record Office of Ireland burned during the Civil War. What we have are the depositions in Trinity College, Dublin, a contemporary pamphlet, letters, and newspaper reports. The sentences the 8 women received are inferred from what the 1586 Act prescribed, not confirmed by a surviving court document. That's the honest version of the evidence. The spring assizes opened in Carrickfergus on the 31st of March, 1711. 2 judges presided. Their names are Anthony Upton of the Court of Common Pleas and James McCartney of the King's Bench. And here is something the sources are clear about. These 2 men disagreed, openly, in court. Upton looked at the 8 accused women and told the jury to acquit them. He pointed to their blameless lives, their regular church attendance, the absence of any credible evidence beyond the fits of one young woman. He was skeptical, and he said so. McCartney took the opposite view. He believed Mary Dunbar's accusations were credible. He believed the spectral evidence, the testimony that these women had appeared to her in visions during her fits, was sufficient. He urged the jury to convict. The jury sided with McCartney. All 8 women were found guilty on the same day, the 31st of March, 1711. Now, the accused had no lawyer. They denied the charge, every one of them, and the jury still convicted in a single session, with 2 judges giving them contradictory instructions, and one of those judges explicitly asking for an acquittal. That detail sits in the record and doesn't move. Upton asked for acquittal. The jury convicted anyway. The sentence the 8 women received, and I want to be precise here because the precision matters, is what the 1586 Act prescribed for causing injury, not death. 1 year in prison, and 4 appearances in the pillory on market day, 6 hours each time. The pillory meant you stood in public, head and hands locked in the wooden frame, while anyone who wanted to could throw things at you. Eggs, vegetables, whatever was to hand. There is a story that circulates about the pillory sessions, that one of the women lost an eye. But this story is contested in every version I can find, and the versions contradict each other. One account, traced to a 19th century Carrickfergus historian, says it happened during the pillory itself, that the crowd threw eggs and cabbage stalks, and a woman was blinded. Another version says a woman lost an eye to a mob at the moment of her arrest, before the trial. These 2 accounts can't both be right about when it happened, and neither of them traces back to the 1711 documents. So I'm telling you the story exists, and I'm telling you it doesn't have a verified source. If it happened, it happened. But I can't tell you it happened as fact. What I can tell you is that when the year was up and the women were released, they were ostracized. The community that had known them all their lives shut them out. While the 8 women were serving their sentences, something happened that changed the shape of the case entirely. Mary Dunbar died. The sources agree she died sometime after the March trial. One source says April, but that specific month doesn't appear consistently enough across independent accounts to treat as confirmed. What is consistent is that she died before the September assizes. She died young, 18 or close to it. The causes are listed as unknown. And here is the thing about her death that the law cared about. It didn't improve after the 8 women were convicted and imprisoned. Normally, in the demonological framework of the time, incarcerating the witches was supposed to break their hold on the afflicted person. The fits should have stopped. The suffering should have ended. For Mary Dunbar, it didn't. The sources note this explicitly. Unlike most demoniacs, the conviction and imprisonment of the accused did not relieve her symptoms. She continued to suffer, and then she died. And before she died, she had made a new accusation. She said that a man named William Cellar had begun bewitching her. William Cellar was the husband of Janet Liston, one of the 8 convicted women, and the father of Elizabeth Cellar, another of the 8. 2 of his family members were already in prison, and now he was accused, and Mary Dunar was dead. William Cellar's trial came at the summer assizes in September 1711, and the legal situation he faced was different from the one the 8 women had faced in March, because of the 1586 Act's 2-tier structure. When Mary Dunar was alive and suffering, the charge against him was causing injury by witchcraft. 1 year in prison, 4 stints in the pillory, but Mary Dunar was now dead, and the Act said, causing death by witchcraft carries the death penalty. Her death, in the eyes of the law, converted his offense. The injury he was accused of causing had become a killing. Whether or not he had actually done anything, whether or not witchcraft was real, whether or not any of this had any basis in fact, the legal mechanism was clear. If the jury convicted him of bewitching Mary Dunar and Mary Dunar was dead, he hanged. William Cellar was convicted. The jury found him guilty at the September assizes. What happened next is not confirmed by any surviving document. No execution record exists, but the historians who have worked most closely with these sources, including Andrew Snedden, who led the W1711.org project, assess it as probable that he was executed. Probable, not certain. The honest word is probable. He may have been one of only 2 people ever executed in Ireland under a Witchcraft Act. The identity of the other is not independently confirmed. Let's talk about what doesn't survive, because the absence is part of the story. The Public Record Office of Ireland held the nation's legal and administrative records, centuries of court documents, land surveys, parish registers, trial records. In June 1922, during the Irish Civil War, the Four Courts complex in Dublin was shelled and caught fire. The PRO was inside, the records burned. Historians call it one of the greatest archival catastrophes in European history. Anything that existed in the way of official trial records for the Island Magee case, the formal verdict, the sentencing documents, the court's own account of what happened, was almost certainly in that building. It's gone. What survived did so because it was somewhere else. The pre-trial depositions that Edward Clements took in early 1711 were in Trinity College, Dublin, not the PRO. They survived. The contemporary pamphlet, printed at the time, circulated as pamphlets were, survived in copies. Letters and newspaper reports from 1711 survived in various collections. Andrew Snedden's W1711.org project is the first systematic effort to bring all of these together, transcribe them, and annotate them. Snedden notes that later accounts, 19th century histories, local histories, popular retellings, introduce material that isn't in the 1711 sources, and that this invented material then got cited by still later sources as if it were original. The I story is probably one of those. The record is thin, and parts of what people think they know about this case aren't in it. The depositions that do survive are genuinely remarkable documents. They're the only pretrial witchcraft depositions known to exist from Ireland. Every other Irish witchcraft case either left no pretrial record or that record is gone. These ones are in Trinity College, Dublin, in Edward Clement's hand, and they record what witnesses said under oath in early 1711. What they contain, the specific testimony, the precise language people used to describe what they saw, is something historians have had to work to reconstruct, because the pamphlet and the depositions don't always match, and the newspaper reports add their own layer. What the depositions give you is the procedural reality. This is what the mayor of Carrickfergus wrote down when he sat with witnesses and asked them what they had seen. The witnesses described Mary Dunbar's fits. They described the objects she vomited. They described the names she called out during her episodes, and those names became the charge sheet. There's something worth sitting with in that process. The mechanism by which 8 women ended up in a courtroom was: one person had fits, named names during the fits, and a magistrate wrote the names down. That's the chain. Clements wasn't corrupt, as far as the record shows. He was following established procedure for a witchcraft complaint. The procedure itself was the problem. But the procedure was law. I want to go back to Mary Dunar for a moment, because she's easy to flatten into a single role in this story, and she's more complicated than that. She was 18. She was educated. The sources use that word, gentlewoman, which in this context means she could read and write and had some social standing. She arrived at a house that had already been the site of months of reported supernatural disturbance. The woman who'd lived there had just died, under circumstances the community found troubling. And within days of Mary's arrival, she began exhibiting the classic symptoms of demonic possession as understood in her time and place. Here's the thing about those symptoms. They weren't random. They were specific, theologically specific. Throwing Bibles, going rigid near clergy, vomiting objects. These were the recognized signs. They appeared in the literature. They appeared in Scottish and English case records that educated people in 1711 would have known about. Whether Mary Dunar was experiencing a genuine psychological crisis, whether she was performing symptoms she'd absorbed from that literature, whether something else entirely was happening, we can't know. What we know is that she never gave evidence in court. She never spoke during the proceedings. Her accusations existed entirely in the pretrial depositions. The court convicted 8 women on the basis of written statements from a woman who wasn't present to be questioned. That's the record. The Presbyterian community of Island Magee is important to understand here because the trial didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a specific denominational context with specific theological commitments. Scottish Presbyterianism in the late 17th and early 18th century had a more active engagement with the reality of witchcraft than the Church of England did. This wasn't ignorance, it was theology. The belief was that Satan operated directly in the world through human agents, and that identifying and prosecuting those agents was a religious duty. The great Scottish witch trials of the 17th century, and there were many, far more than in England, happened in this framework. When Ulster Scots families settled on Island Magee, they brought that framework with them. So when Anne Haltridge said she was being tormented, and when Mary Dunar began naming names, the community's response, calling in the magistrate, taking depositions, proceeding to trial, was consistent with how they understood the world to work. Judge McCartney, who pushed for conviction, was operating in that same framework. Judge Upton's skepticism was the outlier, not the norm, and the jury, 12 men from that community, sided with the framework they'd grown up in. That's not a defense of what happened. It's the context, without which the verdict doesn't make sense. There's a Catholic priest in this story who doesn't get much attention, and I think he deserves a moment. Among the various remedies attempted for Mary Dunar's fits, local physicians, Presbyterian clergy, prayer, someone brought in a Catholic priest to try a counter-charm. This is Island Magee in 1711, remember, a predominantly Presbyterian Ulster Scots community. The presence of a Catholic priest trying a folk remedy for what the Presbyterians were calling demonic possession is a detail that sits oddly against the denominational backdrop. It didn't work. The sources note it among the list of failed interventions. Physicians tried, clergymen tried, Catholic priests tried, nothing helped. But the fact that it was tried at all suggests something about the desperation in that house, or about the pragmatic folk beliefs running underneath the official theology. When nothing works, you try everything. The official Presbyterian position on witchcraft was theological and serious. The folk practices running alongside it were more eclectic. A counter-charm from a Catholic priest doesn't fit neatly into either framework, which is probably why it doesn't get much space in the accounts. But it's there, it's in the record, and it didn't help. Let me tell you about the wider context of Irish witchcraft, because Island Magee 1711 is the last case, and last cases only make sense if you know there were earlier ones. The first major Irish witchcraft prosecution on record is Alice Kittler in Kilkenny in 1324, a wealthy widow accused of sorcery. Kittler herself escaped. Her servant, Petronella, was executed. That's the 14th century. Jump forward to 1661. Florence Newton of Kinsale was tried for witchcraft and, by the accounts that survive, executed. Then, 1698, a woman in Antrim was strangled as a suspected witch by her neighbors outside any legal process. And then Eilean Magee, 1711. That's the arc of documented Irish witchcraft cases, sparse, centuries apart, and ending with the 9 convictions in Carrickfergus. The trial is sometimes described as Ireland's only witch trial, which isn't accurate. It's Ireland's last witch trial, and its only mass trial. Multiple accused, multiple convictions in a single proceeding. The distinction matters. The Irish Witchcraft Act of 1586 stayed on the books for over a century after the Eilean Magee trial. It wasn't repealed until 1821. That's worth a moment. The law under which 9 people were convicted in 1711 remained valid Irish law for another 110 years. No one was prosecuted under it again after Eilean Magee, as far as the surviving record shows. But it was there. The repeal in 1821 was part of a broader legal modernization, not a specific response to Eilean Magee. Nobody in 1821 was saying, we need to fix what happened to those 8 women in 1711. They were saying, this statute is archaic and we're tidying the books, the women themselves. The 8 who served their year in prison and their 4 stints in the pillory were ostracized when they got out. The community that had known them, the community of 300 people on an 8-mile peninsula, closed around them. What happened to them after that, individually, is not in the record. Their names are in the depositions and the pamphlet and the newspaper reports of 1711, and then they're gone. Janet Carson, Janet Latimer, Janet Main, Janet Miller, Margaret Mitchell, Catherine McCalman, Janet Liston, Elizabeth Cellar. The record has their names. It doesn't have what came after. Andrew Snedden's project, Parfin, the W1711 org work that he and Victoria McCollum began in 2011, is the most serious scholarly effort to date to sort out what the 1711 documents actually say versus what later accounts invented. Snedden's specific criticism is pointed. Later historians introduce material that isn't in the original sources, and then that invented material got cited by still later historians as if it came from 1711. The record grew in the telling. This is a common problem with cases that attract popular attention. Each retelling adds a detail, smooths an ambiguity, resolves an uncertainty that the original documents left open. And then the next writer cites the retelling, not the document. The I story is the most obvious example. It appears in 19th century local history. It gets repeated. It gets cited. It becomes, in some accounts, an established fact about the Eilean Magee trial. But it doesn't trace to the depositions or the pamphlet or the letters from 1711. Snedden's work is an attempt to strip that back, to say, here is what the surviving 1711 documents actually contain. Here is what was added later, and here is the line between them. The depositions in Trinity College Dublin are the anchor. Everything else gets measured against them. I want to go back to William Cellar one more time, because his case is the strangest part of this story, and it tends to get compressed. He was tried separately in September 1711, 6 months after the 8 women. His wife Janet Liston and his daughter Elizabeth Cellar were already convicted and in prison. Mary Dunar, who had accused him, was already dead. The prosecution's case rested on depositions taken before her death, statements she had made accusing him of bewitching her. She couldn't be cross-examined. She wasn't there. The jury convicted him anyway. And then the question of his sentence turned on the fact of her death. Under the 1586 Act, if your bewitching caused death, you died. The historians who have studied this most closely assess it as probable that William Cellar was executed, but there is no execution record. The PRO fire took whatever official documentation might have confirmed it. What we have is the legal logic. She's dead. The act says death for causing death. He was convicted. And the assessment that it probably happened. Probable. The word keeps coming up in this case. Probably sentenced. Probably executed. Probably one of two people ever executed under an Irish Witchcraft Act. The case runs on probability because the certainties burned in 1922. There's a version of this story that treats Mary Dunar as the villain, the girl who sent 8 women to prison and probably sent a man to the gallows. And I understand why that version exists. She named names. The names she gave became convictions. But I keep coming back to what the sources actually show us about her. She was 18. She arrived at a house that had been the site of months of reported supernatural disturbance. She began having fits that the community around her, the physicians, the clergy, and the magistrate, all treated as genuine. She never recovered after the convictions. The fits didn't stop, which was supposed to happen if the witches were real and in prison. She died. Unknown causes, sometime in the months after the March trial. Whether she was a girl in genuine psychological crisis, whether she was something else, whether the community's response to her distress created a mechanism that she couldn't control once it started, the documents don't tell us. What they tell us is that she never spoke in court. Her voice exists only in the depositions Clements took before the trial. And then she was gone. The 8 women she accused outlived her. They served their sentences and came home to a community that wouldn't have them. She didn't outlive the things she'd started. Let's talk about what the trial looked like from the outside. From the perspective of someone in Carrickfergus in March 1711 who wasn't directly involved. Carrickfergus was a garrison town, a port, a place with a castle and a courthouse and a market. The assizes were a public event. The judges rode in on circuit. The court sat. The town filled up. A witchcraft trial would have drawn a crowd. The pamphlet that was printed shortly after the trial suggests there was significant public interest. Pamphlets got printed when there was a market for them, and the market was people who wanted to know what had happened. The 2 judges disagreeing openly, Upton for acquittal, McCartney for conviction, would have been visible to anyone in the courtroom. The 8 women denying the charges, one by one, would have been visible. The verdict coming back guilty, all 8 on the same afternoon, would have been visible. And then the sentencing. And then, months later, the pillory sessions on market day. If the accounts of the crowd's behavior during the pillory are accurate, and we've established the uncertainty there, then the public component of the punishment was substantial. This wasn't a private legal proceeding. It was a community event, in a small community, with neighbors watching neighbors be punished. The question of why this happened in 1711, why this particular case, in this particular place, produced Ireland's last witchcraft trial, is one the historians haven't fully resolved. The Presbyterian context of Island Magee is part of it. The specific theological framework that treated witchcraft as a live category, that had a tradition of prosecution in Scotland, that had come to Ulster with the settlers. That's part of the explanation. But Scotland had been pulling back from witchcraft prosecutions by 1711. The Great Scottish Witch Trials were mostly 17th century. By the early 18th century, the intellectual climate in Britain was shifting. Educated skepticism about witchcraft was growing. Judge Upton's position, acquit. These women have blameless lives. This evidence is insufficient, was the direction the legal establishment was moving. McCartney's credulous position was becoming the minority view. The jury sided with McCartney, but they were swimming against a tide. The Irish Witchcraft Act would last another 110 years on the books, but Island Magee was the last time anyone used it. Whether that's because the climate shifted enough that no future case got to trial, or because there simply weren't more cases of this kind brought forward, the record doesn't say. What it says is 1711, Carrickfergus, 9 convictions, and then nothing. Now we get to 2015, 304 years after the trial. A novelist named Martina Devlin, who had written a book about the Island Magee case, wanted to put up a memorial to the 9 convicted people. A plaque, something physical and permanent in the place where it happened. She brought the proposal to Larnborough Council, which had jurisdiction over the area. The council considered it, and a unionist councillor objected. The grounds for the objection, erecting a memorial to people convicted of witchcraft, would be tantamount to devil worship. The council shelved the proposal. No memorial. In 2015. I'm not editorializing here. I'm telling you what happened. A proposal to commemorate 9 people convicted at Ireland's last witch trial in 2015 was blocked on the grounds that commemorating them was equivalent to endorsing witchcraft. The proposal died. Martina Devlin's book existed. The academic work on the case existed. The depositions in Trinity College Dublin existed. But there was nothing on the ground in Island Magee to mark what had happened there in 1711. That was 2015. The story doesn't end there. 8 years after the Larnborough Council refusal, the question came back. By 2022, local government in Northern Ireland had been reorganized, and the area fell under Mid and East Antrim Borough Council. In November and December of 2022, the council considered a proposal for a commemorative plaque, not a memorial, a plaque, to all 9 convicted people, to be installed at the Gobbins Visitor Center in Island Magee. The Gobbins is a cliff path attraction on the peninsula, a tourist site. The council approved the proposal. The plaque was unveiled by the mayor in March 2023. The Irish News reported on it on the 21st of March 2023, 312 years after the trial. And here's the detail that I find most telling about the whole thing. The proposed inscription included the line, "Today, the community recognizes your innocence." That line was removed before the plaque was made. A unionist councillor objected that the council could not make such a claim, that it was not within the council's authority to declare the 9 people innocent. The plaque went up without the word innocent. It commemorates. It does not exonerate. In 2023, the plaque exists. The word doesn't. The argument that the council couldn't declare innocence is, strictly speaking, a legal argument. Courts convict and acquit. Councils put up plaques. The council's authority to retrospectively exonerate anyone is genuinely debatable as a matter of institutional competence. But the effect of that argument in practice is that a plaque commemorating 9 people convicted of witchcraft in 1711 cannot say they were innocent. The legal framework that convicted them was repealed in 1821. The intellectual framework that made the evidence credible, spectral testimony, the vomiting of objects, demonic possession as a live legal category, has not been operative for centuries. The 8 women denied the charges. Every one of them. They said they hadn't done it. And the plaque that finally went up in 2023, after a 2015 attempt was blocked as devil worship, commemorates them without saying they were right. That's where the story ends, physically. A plaque at a visitor center on an 8-mile peninsula in County Antrim. The names on it: Janet Carson, Janet Latimer, Janet Main, Janet Miller, Margaret Mitchell, Catherine McCalman, Janet Liston, Elizabeth Cellar, and William Cellar, all 9. The word innocent is not there. There's a question that runs underneath this whole case that the documents can't answer, and I want to name it because I think it's the honest thing to do. We don't know what was actually happening in No Head House. We don't know what Anne Haltridge experienced in the autumn and winter of 1710. We don't know what Mary Dunar was experiencing when she had her fits. The explanations available in 1711, demonic possession, witchcraft, were the explanations the community had. We have different explanations available now: psychological crisis, conversion disorder, the social contagion of reported symptoms, in a community primed to expect them, the specific pressure of being an 18-year-old woman in a house where something terrible had just happened. None of these are in the 1711 documents because they weren't available in 1711. What the documents show is the mechanism, reported symptoms, named accusers, sworn depositions, trial, conviction, sentence. 8 women denied the charges one by one and were convicted anyway, on the depositions of a woman who never appeared in court to be questioned. That's what the record shows clearly. Not what caused Mary Dunbar's fits, what happened to the people she named. I want to come back to the depositions one more time, because they're the closest thing this case has to a primary voice. Edward Clements, mayor of Carrickfergus, sat with witnesses in early 1711 and wrote down what they said. He wrote it in the formal language of legal deposition. Sworn statements, witnessed, dated. The originals are in Trinity College, Dublin. They've been there since 1711. They survived the PRO fire because they weren't in the PRO, and they're the only documents of their kind from any Irish witchcraft case. Every other Irish witchcraft prosecution, Alice Keitler in 1324, Florence Newton in 1661, the Antrim strangling in 1698, left no pretrial depositions, or those depositions are gone. Island Magee has them. They're thin. The case was thin, the community was small, the events compressed into a few months, but they're real. They record what people said they saw, in their own words, as transcribed by a magistrate, in the weeks before 8 women were put on trial for their lives. The pamphlet reconstructs. The newspaper reports summarize. The depositions are the closest the record gets to the room. And the room was a house on an 8-mile peninsula where an elderly widow had died, and an 18-year-old was having fits, and a community was trying to make sense of both.